Today, even in this era of Obama, in this time of supposed color blindness, we now have created a system of mass incarceration, a penal system unprecedented in world history. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of even highly repressive regimes like Russia or China or Iran. And the majority of the increase in incarceration in the United States have been among impoverished people of color who, once they're swept into the system, are then stripped of the very rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement. And yet the topic of mass incarceration has been one, that has been rarely raised.
Is there research that confirms that the backlash is against black criminals or against criminals, just crime?
Well, there's an enormous amount of research that suggests that the backlash and the punitive impulse was not simply in response to crime, but was much more deeply connected to racial attitudes, racial fears and anxieties. And in fact, the political strategists who conceived of the Get Tough movement and the war on drugs quite deliberately used not so subtle racial appeals and racial code language with the purpose of trying to exploit both conscious and unconscious racial biases and stereotypes for political gain. The Southern strategy.
By which Richard Nixon was elected president.
Yes. The basis of the Southern strategy was using these kind of racially coded get tough appeals on issues of crime and welfare to appeal to poor and working class whites, particularly in the South, who are anxious about, threatened by, resentful of many of the gains of African Americans in the civil rights movement. And to be fair, I think we have got to acknowledge that poor and working class whites really had their world rocked by the civil rights movement. Wealthy whites could send their kids to private schools, give their kids all of the advantages that wealth has to offer. But poor and working class whites in the South, many of whom were themselves struggling for survival, who were desperately poor, often illiterate, they were the ones who might have to ship their kids across town to go to a school they believed were inferior. It was they who were suddenly forced to compete on equal terms for limited jobs with this whole group of people they've been taught their whole lives to believe were inferior to them. And this state of affairs did create an enormous amount of fear, resentment, and anxiety, and an enormous political opportunity.
What about now? How do you see that playing out?
Well, I see it most obviously in the immigration debate. Today, we see that this fear of immigrants coming across the border to take jobs and to take educational resources and who are going to drain the tax base of your county, these fears that they are coming to take from you is leading and has led to another sort of get tough movement. Get tough on them, those immigrants who have violated the law by crossing over. And this wave of punitiveness now directed towards immigrants is leading to the same kind of indifference towards their basic humanity that we have seen in the war on drugs and the Get Tough movement that led to the rise of mass incarceration. I mean, race has been used as a wedge again and again throughout American history to divide the lower classes, if you will, and to create an environment in which poor and working class people are pit against one another. But that does not mean that, all or even most poor and working class white folks are harboring any conscious racial resentments. I know that there are those folks out there for sure, but I think much of it lies in the unconscious stereotypes and fears and biases that we all have within us that get exploited in these moments where groups are scapegoated and fears are stoked, resulting in the emergence of these new systems. I mean, we are having mass deportation today at the same time as we are having mass incarceration.
Mass deportation, I must say, by a black president.
Absolutely. It's one of the great ironies, just as it's, an irony that the greatest escalation of the drug war was under President Clinton, who, many African Americans called our first black president.
I remember that.
And it was President Clinton, a Democrat, who escalated the drug war far beyond what President Reagan or President Nixon had even dreamed possible. And it was the Clinton administration that championed laws banning drug offenders even from federal financial aid for schooling, upon their release, banning drug offenders and people with criminal convictions from, public housing. To a large extent, many of the rules, laws, policies, and practices that now constitute this caste-like system were championed by a Democratic president and administration, desperate to win back those so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the Civil Rights.
I was going to ask you, what do you think is the dynamic that drove Clinton and now drives Obama? Is it to satisfy the base they think most hostile to them?
I think so. And, what I find most unfortunate, though, of the politics that have developed over the years, the politics of trying to appease, poor and working class whites, not by building explicitly multiracial, multi-ethnic, coalitions and alliances that encourage solidarity across racial and class lines, but instead by kind of tossing these symbolic bones, saying, well, we're escalating the drug war, we're getting tough on them, don't you feel better now? We're willing to get tough by deporting even more immigrants than ever have been deported before. Don't you feel better now? We fall into the trap of really playing to people's, baser fears and instincts rather than risking perhaps some short-term losses, but building the kind of unity and the kind of solidarity across race and class lines, which I believe would help to ensure a much more stable foundation for the kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic, inclusive democracy that I would hope for.